The picturesque French town of Bourg-Saint-Ondial probably seemed a good place to be on the fateful morning of April the 6th, 2005, as Włodek Szymanowski kitted up, for Bourg-Saint-Ondial is home to some magnificent flooded cave systems, and Włodek was about to explore one of them, but fate had different plans. This is Włodek Szymanowski's story. Włodek Szymanowski is a Polish caver who has long ties to the OUCC, the Oxford University Cave Club. The purpose of the club is to find places that quite literally no one has ever been to before, and explore and map new cave passages. The OUCC cavers have been quite successful in exploration in the UK, especially in Wales, and on expeditions overseas. While Włodek had been an outstanding caver of his generation, it was only in the latter stages of his life that he took up cave diving. In late December 2000, Włodek set out on one of his regular journeys to the Polish Tatra Mountains to do a spot of winter caving. By the time he returned home, a week or so later, he was a dissatisfied man. Włodek, now 42 years old, had witnessed a younger generation of cavers going boldly where he had never dared. Fast forward to March 2001, and Włodek is sitting poolside in Hurghada, Egypt, a resort on the Red Sea coast famous for its diving. Accompanied by a group of his colleagues from the Warsaw office of Siemens Financial Limited, Włodek had managed to persuade his employer that it would be a good idea if he and his team were to fly off and do a bit of team integration, and where better than at a warm water tourist resort that happens to be a mecca for open water diving. Once there, he enrolled in a diving course and took the first steps towards his goal of becoming a cave diver. He returned home proudly, holding a PADI, open water diver certificate, dated the 13th of March 2001. In spite of an earlier assurance to his wife that he would not take up cave diving, by June 2001, Włodek had already consulted with one of Poland's leading cave divers at the time, Victor Bolek, and had bought enough kit to get started, and enrolled himself in a cave diving course. In August 2001, Victor Bolek led a Polish cave diving expedition to a large resurgence, Izbuku Towers, in the Bihor region of Romania, and as a rookie diver, Włodek went along. But being a rookie did not stop him diving to a depth of 50 meters, or 164 feet. It should be noted that on this expedition the group of Polish cave divers first tested a rebreather unit called the Buddy Inspiration. So, following the expedition, with the zeal of his newfound passion, Włodek went about getting as much training under his weight belt as possible. On the 4th of April 2005, Włodek joined a small team organised by another Warsaw cave diver and headed off to the pretty town of Bourg-Saint-Ondial in the Ardèche area of France. This was very much at the tourist end of the spectrum, as the caves of Bourg-Saint-Ondial were already being explored by French divers. Then, on the 5th of April, at around 9 p.m, Włodek dived for around 80 minutes to a maximum depth of 9.4 meters, or about 30 feet, in what is very likely to have been the Goul de la Tannerie cave, a deep advanced cave system with a maximum depth of 220 meters, or 722 feet. This dive was recorded on one of his dive computers. The next cave that Włodek chose to dive in was Goul de Pont, which is situated just a few hundred meters from the Goul de la Tannerie. Goul de Pont is located within the boundaries of Bourg-Saint-Ondial and is to be found under the viaduct of the SNCF railway. This fateful cave is responsible for changing the trajectory of Włodek's life forever. On April the 6th, 2005, Włodek arrived at Ardèche and Drôme, the two southernmost areas of the Auvergne-Rhône Alps region in south-central France, featuring rolling hills and low mountain ranges, deep canyons, a Mediterranean climate, and lush green vegetation. The cave he had chosen for that day's dive was the Goul de Pont, a completely flooded cave system that is entered via a 3 to 4 meter diameter walled-off pool situated under an arched railway viaduct. The dive promised to be a good one. Not only was the cave reputed to contain splendid, spacious passages and crystal clear water, but it was also very deep, having already been pushed to 178 meters, or 583 feet, by French explorers. While Włodek was not equipped to reach such a depth, this dive was nevertheless an opportunity to see many of the splendid submerged passages, and, perhaps, finally to better his personal depth record of 102.7 meters, or 336 feet, that he'd set some 2 years previously. Deep dives, such as the one Włodek was preparing to undertake, require a high level of expertise and specialized equipment. By now, Włodek had acquired both, having been actively cave diving for 4 years, and had become one of the leading experts within Poland in what is sometimes referred to as technical diving. For this dive, he would use his much-trusted Buddy Inspiration rebreather equipment and would breathe a specialized gas mixture known as a trimix, formulated specifically for deep diving. The Buddy Inspiration is a computer-controlled technical marvel of some aqua engineering that is used as a replacement for the traditional Jacques Cousteau type of scuba equipment. In the right circumstances, a rebreather can allow a diver to stay underwater longer and generally extend a diver's underwater capabilities. As with so many things, this comes at a price, higher initial cost, and higher technical complexity before and during use. It's probably also fair to say that the scope for potential problems is also extended. But all of this techie complexity was just what Włodek liked. His fascination with gadgets was immeasurable, as was his love of risk-taking. That morning, there had been some minor damp-related problems with his rebreather as a result of residual water from the short dive he'd done the previous evening, but nothing to cause him undue worry or force him to abort the dive. The previous evening's dive also proved that the equipment was functioning correctly, so it was all systems go for the Goul de Pont. He stepped into the entrance pool and attached his 2 10-litre cylinders to his harness, each weighing around 15 kilograms. That had been pre-placed in the water. The cylinders, each equipped with a breathing regulator, were a critical safety backup in case of the rebreather failure underwater. In an emergency, either could be used independently of the rebreather, with one containing trimix, designed for emergency use in the deeper parts of the cave, and the other containing a gas mixture for the shallower depths. After performing the long-winded but necessary pre-dive checks on his rebreather, Włodek's head dipped below the water and he began his dive. As he descended, Włodek had many things to keep himself busy, in addition to enjoying the spectacle of the cave passage around him. One of the most important of these tasks was regular and frequent monitoring of the oxygen level of the gas he was breathing. After passing the shingle constriction located 12 meters from the entrance, Włodek reached a relatively horizontal piece of passage that quickly widens out. The water was, as expected, exceptionally clear that day, and his helmet-mounted lights pierced the darkness with ease, allowing him to see far ahead into the inky distance. Then, at a depth of 18 meters, and just 75 meters from the entrance, the cave passage changes direction abruptly and plunges headlong into the depths. This is where the real challenge of the cave begins. For those unfamiliar with diving, following the passage down was not simply a matter of Włodek rotating his body into a vertical position with his head pointing down and going for it. A diver, particularly when using the Buddy Inspiration rebreather, needs to maintain a relatively horizontal position in the water. Descent and ascent are normally controlled by regulating the buoyancy of the diver, reduce the buoyancy to descend, and increase the buoyancy to ascend. Thus, Włodek releases some air from a buoyancy control device attached to his gear and begins to drift gently downwards. The one complication is that as he descends, the water pressure progressively compresses the remaining air in the buoyancy control device, causing an equally progressive loss in its buoyancy, and, if nothing further is done, will lead to an ever faster rate of descent until Włodek hits the bottom. So, to maintain a controlled rate of descent, he regularly adds new air to the BCD as depth increases. The next 60 meters of depth involve a series of vertical steps in a classic phreatic-shaped passage, The route is lined, and, with the clear conditions that day, finding the guideline would have been no problem. As Włodek began making his way across the passage, he starts to experience some unexpected problems. First was that the effects of nitrogen narcosis that day probably seemed to be greater than he was expecting, and as he descended beyond 164 feet at this point, the effects became progressively worse. Secondly, he needed to work harder to breathe. The deeper he went, the worse this problem would become. In the midst of the unfortunate circumstances, he simply shifted the problem to one side and convinced himself that he was just having a bad day. Alongside this, his perception of the problem was already dulled by the effects of nitrogen narcosis. For reference, most divers describe nitrogen narcosis as feeling like they're uncontrollably drunk or dazed, which in turn causes poor judgment, a sense of euphoria, reduced muscle function, and disorientation. The deeper Włodek descends, the more intoxicating the effects become. At a depth of 79 meters, the series of vertical steps ends, and a horizontal gallery is entered. To proceed along the horizontal gallery, he slightly inflates his BCD so as to give himself neutral buoyancy. By this depth, Włodek's breathing has only become more laboured, accompanied with severe disorientation. Nevertheless, he pushes on along the gallery to the head of the magnificent 30-metre pitch. It is always difficult to be sure of the motivation behind a person's actions, but the decision to press on would have been made in the knowledge that the pitch is a very fine example of its kind, and that its final depth of around 110 metres, or 360 feet, gave him a chance to beat his personal depth record. Włodek was a strongly self-motivated individual who didn't like to allow minor inconveniences to sidetrack him from his goals. He positively relished adversity and challenge, since they made the final victory even sweeter. Instead of turning back, as he clearly should have done, he continued with the dive, in spite of the difficulties he continued to experience at this point. To descend the pitch, he now needed to vent off a small amount of air from the BCD in order to achieve a slight negative buoyancy. As he slowly descended the pitch, the symptoms he had experienced earlier was worsened immensely with each metre of depth added. The progressively increasing narcosis would have adversely affected both his ability to operate the complex diving equipment he was wearing and his perception of the situation in which he found himself. In addition to the ever-increasing narcosis, the gas he was breathing also became denser and, as a consequence, it would have become increasingly difficult to breathe. Suddenly, in his increasingly narcotic and befuddled state, at a depth of 328 feet, narcosis simply overwhelmed his ability to regulate his buoyancy. Włodek began descending uncontrollably to the cave floor with immense speed. As he drifted downwards out of control, he came to rest on a ledge at a depth of 345 feet. His rebreather system now damaged from the initial impact. By now, he would have been, at best, in a partially conscious state. The inability to breathe briefly jolted him into action. The rebreather had a modification that allowed him to switch from the main rebreather circuit and breathe directly from one of its small onboard cylinders. The logic was that even if the rebreather had somehow malfunctioned, the onboard cylinder should not be affected by the malfunction. Theoretically, the small cylinder contained enough gas to last him only 60 to 90 seconds, but that should normally be sufficient time for him to get off the rebreather and onto the external emergency cylinder. He turned the switch and would have found that he could once again breathe. Unfortunately, he was by now capable of doing very little else. He lay there, physically and mentally unable to make the relatively simple but absolutely crucial move over to his attached emergency cylinder, which remained untouched. Within less than a minute of the switchover to the onboard cylinder, the mouthpiece left his mouth, and he drowned. He was 46 years old. By 3 p.m. he had not returned, and the surface party decided to try to see for themselves if anything could be done, carrying out 2 dives to a maximum depth of 70 meters, or 230 feet, but to no avail. With all reasonable hope gone, the rescue services were alerted for what was by then certain to be a body retrieval. The next day, the French rescue party located Włodek's body at a depth of 105 meters, close to the bottom of the 30-meter pitch, with the mouthpiece out of his mouth. If you made it this far, I'd just like to say thank you for watching. Please feel free to drop any suggestions you have down below. This has been gripping horror, and I hope to see you in the next one.